professor
culture and
for
leadership
40 years at
program.
University of Oregon in cognitive neuroscience.
It's a
And
very long title.
when I was
I'm not going to say
interviewing,
it today.
I could
You know, I
interview at one
should.
point. I was like, I'm familiar with. I haven't been in academia because I just, I didn't have a full-time appointment until 5 years ago. But I was like, but at the dinner table, almost like the most common phrase I remember at our dinner table growing up started with the phrase "the fucking provost."
Are we standing by still?
was about the most
Standing
common
standing by,
complaint.
friends.
Because my dad was always upset about something at the university. Now I understand.
All right.
She's been pretty good for a job that's a difficult job.
That's
difficult times.
Oh my God!
You know.
I mean, yes.
It's like,
I mean,
Okay,
just
friends.
like I don't judge because
Okay. All right. Hello and welcome to Cabinet Conversations. Yeah. I'm Erica Scott, the Artistic Programming Manager here at Ford's Theater. And if you are joining us for the first time, this is our live series exploring creativity, history, and leadership. We are so excited to be having our first ever hybrid performance with people joining us both in studio and at home. You can learn more about our past programs and explore by visiting the public programs page on our website, www.fords.org. Okay, now for the good stuff. History often highlights a few names, but lasting change in American democracy is powered by many voices. For today's conversation, we will explore some of the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement, the challenges of preserving their stories, and the enduring inspiration of the I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial. Today, we welcome Dr. Dayo F. Gore, playwright Ches Jacobs, and director Aaron Posner. I'm going to do some bios now, everyone, so bear with me. Dr. Dayo F. Gore is Associate Professor in the Department of Black Studies at Georgetown University. Dr. Gore is the author of Radicalism in the Crossroads, African American Women Activists in the Cold War, co-editor of Want to Start a Revolution, Radical Women in Black Freedom Struggle, and is currently completing a book-length study of African American women's transnational travels and activism in the long 20th century. She has previously taught at the University of California, San Diego, where she served as founding director of the Black Studies Project. And in 2023, Dr. Gore received a Marguerite Casey Freedom Scholar Award and is currently active in Scholars for Social Justice. Ches Jacobs is a Black and Jewish American writer, sociologist, ecologist, and the author of their debut play, The American Five. Ches's work seeks, yes, y'all can applaud for that because, yeah. Ches's work as an actor, director, and dramaturg has been seen on Broadway, off-Broadway, and regionally at theaters including Olney Theater, Steppenwolf Theater Company, and Indiana Repertory Theater. And then beginning in 2026, Ches will be pursuing their PhD at UMD at College Park. Aaron Posner is an award-winning director, playwright, teacher, and former artistic director of the Philadelphia's Arden Theater and New Jersey's Two River Theater. He has directed more than 150 productions at major regional theaters across the country, including virtually every single theater here in the DC area. As a playwright, his re-imaging of Chekhov's The Seagull entitled Stupid Effing Bird is one of the 10 most produced plays in the country, and in 2015, and has had more than 150 productions of its own worldwide. Some of his other plays include The Heel, JQA, Life Sucks, No Sisters, District Merchants, and many, many more. Welcome to you all. Yes. I have to get used to applause. This is so wonderful. As a reminder to our audience, both here and at home, we are taking questions via Slido. Please scan the QR code that we have provided to submit your questions to our guests during the program. I see them. I will field them in. Please don't worry if I don't get to them right away. All right, let's get to the meat of this program. So we kind of have set up the discussion in these three pillars that all relate to Lincoln and somehow also relate back to Ches's piece, The American Five. So I'm going to start with how we got to this point. So Ches was a part of the Ford's Theater Legacy Commission program The Legacy Commission program was established in 2021, with its first workshops being in 2023. And it serves as an artistic incubator for stories about social justice and racial history, and explores the varied experiences of underrepresented characters and lesser-known historical figures, including unsung heroes responsible for challenging and changing the course of civil rights and equality in the American life. Chess was a part of the 2024 cohort. He submitted a play that was extremely solid, but I promise you it was 2 separate plays. And we told him he needed to choose, and thank the Lord he chose this one first. Both were amazing. He could have gone far with the other one, but this one seemed right on time. We matched him with Aaron to do the workshop for First Look, and then that's how we got through the process of now having a full production here on our stage right now, today. So if you haven't seen it, get your tickets. And it's amazing. It really, really is. It's a beautiful, beautiful show. Why Chess do you think that you chose this one right now?
Well, in the original script, I was attempting to talk about so much, not only, these characters, but also in the Act 2 version, referencing several of the characters or people, historical figures that were not mentioned in the more meatier Act 3. And then in another act of that show, it was a 3-act play that I'd submitted. There were just like fictional characters in a classroom who were debating topics of anti-Semitism, blackness, social change, X, Y, and Z. And I think after hearing the script out loud and hearing the conversations that I imagine these historical figures to be having, it felt timely at the time. And who knew that it was going to be timely today still when I originally drafted. But that's really why it's giving us an opportunity to look back in history and look at the lessons that are waiting for us if we just know that history and understand it, and see what of that curriculum can be applied for today.
Can you tell us who the 5 are that are featured?
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Coretta Scott King, Bayard Rustin, Stanley Levison, and Clarence B. Jones.
Is there a particular reason you chose those 5 versus others that may have also been involved in this particular?
Yeah, I think the dynamics of them were interesting to me, and also, as much as I wanted to, the more characters that I added to the play, because there were characters in previous, drafts, like President Kennedy was previously in the script, even this summer, which was a decision that I had decided to remove. But I just think at looking at the dynamic of these specific 5 was very interesting, and like the different kinds of people that they represent in society, right? So across wealth, gender, identity, religion, faith, X, Y, and Z. I thought it was a very interesting combination of them.
I love that.
Yeah.
I do. Dayo, can you give us some more historical context? What was happening socially, culturally in the ecosystem that led up to the moment that we know is the
I'm happy
for
to,
freedom?
Yes, I'll
Big question.
Yeah, 4 hours and yeah.
There are a bunch of books I could name, but I just wanted to take a moment and really appreciate including Coretta Scott King in this conversation. I think she's such a central figure that doesn't always get her due for how much she influenced and sort of helped to frame Martin Luther King Jr.'s politics, right? And she sort of was ahead of the game, progressive party very early on when they're still before they even head to the South. And also, we were talking, and just how much I think, including different figures like this, you begin to see the play, the movement as not built on just the people we always see out in front, but really people who have been organizing and active for a long time, deciding, I'm going to commit to this movement. And that's Bayard Rustin, we're talking about Levison, that these figures sort of give us a sense, I love, of the depth and sort of breadth of a movement and what it takes for sort of people to create change, and they might have really different politics. I'm going to just say up front, I haven't seen the play, if anyone hasn't in the audience or not. So I'm I'm hoping to probably stay today and see the matinee. So I'm excited for that. But I think in part, 63 is such an integral moment when we think about the civil rights movement. So the Montgomery bus boycott has already happened. Martin Luther King is already on the rise as a key figure. But you also see in the early 60s, 61, 62, the student movement with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with the sit-ins at the lunch counter that started in North Carolina and spread throughout the nation. You really see young people taking a leadership. And so I think 63 is a moment where we see sort of these established figures that have a national reputation, these longtime activists, someone like Bayard Rustin, who's been around since the 40s trying to push civil rights movement, doing organizing in the North and South, and these young students who are inspired in part by both of those people, but have their own ideas of what the movement should be and have experienced some really scarring violence, right? When they do the sit-ins, when they do the freedom rides in '61, that's a really powerful moment where they try to mobilize. It starts with the core, but then includes SNCC activists, and they try to really mobilize a movement to challenge state governments to adhere to what is federal law, that you can drive and interstate travel should not be segregated. And they're trying to enforce it through the Greyhound buses, and they just meet, when they hit the South, brutal violence, life-scarring violence. And they encounter that along with a federal government that is iffy about enforcing its laws. And these are mostly students who have gone to colleges, I think are the middle class in some ways, going to be the doctors and sort of leaders, and they encounter a sort of inability for the nation to even enforce its laws that really makes them think, what's happening here? I thought, if I had believed that the Constitution mattered so much, what is happening in this moment? And so they begin to get both, I think, a vision of the violence of white supremacy, but then also a vision of a government that's really hesitant to support its own laws on the books. And that, I think, is partly what we see happening in '63, some of the internal, I don't know if the play gets it, but the internal debates that are happening and sort of the different figures that are coming to the stage. And I think it becomes a real moment where you also see in those campaigns where the organizations are working closer together. When the freedom rides happen, it's led by Gore mostly, some SNCC activists, but SNCC is really like, that's not our jam. We're gonna, do some other things. But by the end of it, they're like, this is really intense. We have to send people. And so they're working together. They form collaborative sort of coalitions. They bring in SCLC. And then you see it in '62 when they start voting rights campaigns, that they're building a movement that is actually also collaborating. And that produces both a lot of powerful sort of moments and solidarity. It also produces friction about whose voice dominates, what politics dominates. So I think that's '63 is a moment where from the outside, it's really powerful. You see that solidarity. I think when you get down into it, you see the politics. John Lewis talks about it a lot when he's sort of thinking about what he wants to say versus that. And they're trying to think about how you negotiate this moment, both among all these different organizations, among the structures of white supremacy, but also with government, with Kennedy. So I can see why you might have included Kennedy initially, because he's sort of one of these figures that is both offering a promise of change, but the limitations of sort of political negotiation and government and things like that. So
well, even with the show, it was so hard for me to not just keep writing scenes. And Aaron can tell you about, he would just say one sentence and I'm like, that's a new scene, I'm gonna go write it. But it was so hard for me to stay away from putting even more characters into the script, right? We could have gone the route of bringing in Bull Connor and that tension that was happening in the South, right? We could have gone in a little bit later and brought in Abram Joshua Heschel. Like, there is so much history here alone. Like, the civil rights compendium could be its own catalog of theater in and of itself, which is often underexplored. And there's so many more people out there, besides Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, the people that we hear about all the time. And so really wanted to deeply explore the dynamics and the human dynamics between them and some of these other people.
And that's just such a good testament between, like, history having its lane and the arts having its lane. There were so many more that you could have chosen.
Yes.
There were so many more that could have been included. But like you said, these five and their dynamic were interesting. And when you have to whittle down all of the facts to make it artistically work for a stage,
Right. Right. And who we know the least about.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And like, that was the being part of the Ford's Legacy Commission. It was like, okay, like, I have all of these figures in my head, but like, who do we know the least about? And I even feel like it is very alchemic that, Bayard Rustin just had a biopic made about him, because before that, I was not hearing his name talked about really at all in the public lexicon too. And people definitely know who Coretta Scott King is, but they don't know the depth, her history, her contributions, her work in pacifism and peace before she met Martin, and the legacy in which she continued on after he was assassinated too. So for me, that played a big part in it too.
Yeah. And like for Aaron, like for you have this great responsibility now, because we've chosen these five, and now people know the public version. So people are already coming to the theater with, I don't want to call it a prejudice, but essentially a prejudice. Like, they know these people, or they think they know these people. And it's your job as a director to bring life to them, to bring life to Chess's words. And so the responsibility is great. How did you handle that? How do you focus and to make these real people?
Thanks for that. It's a great question. I mean, it's but it's the human side of things. That this is what we're doing is not this is not factual. This is artistic possibility and artistic license. Going well. Because I had a conversation, there were some people here who had been part of the march who came and saw the show, and they were like, well, this isn't exactly right about, the way this happened. I was like, well, we could have shown 90 people in hundreds of hours of committee meetings that really went into forming the march. That would be super theatrical and fun. So things get distilled down into let's get the core, some of these major forces as they're embodied in these individuals, but then let all of that politics and all of that sociological movement in the world, let that be behind those people. And then when it comes right down to it, we're interested in human beings, and we're interested in people who have passions about things and care about stuff. So what we get to watch is these individual human beings where their own passions and feelings and connections and identities both intersect and then conflict, and we get to watch that sort of played out in these human ways. And then we have this sort of wonderfully enjoyable kind of intersection of Chess's perception and Chess's identities that he's brought into these stories, the real historical characters, which we all researched a lot to go we have to be true enough that we're living in the truth of the characters, but then we have human actors that are bringing their own passions and their own understandings. So when you're watching our Renea Brown play Coretta Scott King, you're watching Chess, can I say this out loud? You're watching Chess and Chess's mom and Chess's relatives as filtered through the truth of Coretta Scott King, as portrayed only as Renea would portray her, with my sensibility as a director, and all of those things are in conversation with each other, and you end up with one version in relation to other human versions, and that's what the theater can do that isn't sociology and isn't history and isn't politics, but I think part of what makes this play so worthwhile, particularly at this moment, is that humanity, that core human experience, is allowing people to go to the core, the human experiences they're having right now, and engage across those lines. So it was an honor to work on.
But I love that so much because I think it also speaks to how events in life and history happens, right? That the historian can't either show all the things, and that these moments are made up of so many different perspectives that I love the ways in which, particularly for art, it can give you the emotion and the sort of interior thoughts and processes people are having in a way that it's hard to, as a historian, I could never say that because I'm bound by sort of strictures of my profession and things like that.
You're bound by truth. You see,
I'm not going to say truth. Because I think my interpretation that has to be backed up by certain standards in the profession. And it's hard to then think, I don't have a letter where Coretta Scott is feeling this about something, but and if I don't have that, I can't say that. But you can
Chess
say
gets
it
to imagine it,
and
then we all get to sort of play with those imaginings, which is really fun.
Which is very powerful.
Yeah, for me, my undergraduate study was basically caked up in history and theater. So to be able to live between the two worlds that they're expressing is kind of how I feel like I was even able to write this show in the first place. And just before this, we were talking about me, going back to school and studying my PhD. And the question was, well, why would you go back to academia if you're doing this? And it's well, because I'm a nerd and I enjoy researching. But also I always say that I love history because it's the old school version of reality TV. If you go back, if you go back and look at history, I mean, it's just spilling tea over spilling tea. It's people who have been able to catalog things and talk about things that happened that we didn't get to see and experience. It was history books before reality TV was how you got to experience that. There was no other way. And so for me to be able to use the history as kind of an outline, a sketchbook, and the rest is just, us getting to paint with the actors and with the designers and everyone has been absolutely amazing.
That's amazing. That's what aligns you to Ford's.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
Ford's is one of those unique, it's the only, in my opinion, theater that does that, where
Yeah,
we bump up
specifically.
history and the arts, and we create this that middle ground.
Yes.
And that's why we have programs like this, where we bring artists and historians together to talk about the same thing, because that's what we do. And how else could we do if we didn't have history to lean
Yeah,
into?
right.
So I love this. Y'all are just giving me life. Dayo, you teach, let me check the slide out. Oh, I have a question that, because we picked 5, was there another working title that you want to share with the world?
We actually, so we had a Post-it note session where we were just like writing all alternative titles, and like nothing really stuck out. But the reason why I felt very confident in picking the American 5 title was because after the workshop, I had or maybe it was before the workshop, but I did a small talk here at Ford's, and somebody came up to me after it. It was a black man who was like a professional, and he said, "I'm so glad that you titled this story The American 5, because people often don't look at black people, Jewish people, and women and think American. They don't think these people are in service of America, that they don't have a duty to their country, or that they are any less American because they are not who you might typically associate with this idea of America." And for me, I really believe that all of this work in civil rights was in service of the country, was to move this country forward. And so that is a quintessentially patriotic and American story. And so these people, we talk about the show as like the first act of building an Avengers story. And I love that, it's been branded as kind of like, the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, the American 5. And so that's kind of what I was trying to do there.
Look at you. That's smart. That's really smart. Like, ordained, but also very smart.
Yeah, I think we really should sell it as the sequel to the Fantastic Four. To the Fantastic Four.
Yeah,
It's
seriously.
sequel sell. So.
That's a good question. That's going to lead me into this question that I'm about to ask Dayo. You teach a class about Black histories in fiction and film. And we've already kind of touched a little bit on it. But I think back to my time when I was in film school in my undergrad years. And what happened many moons ago, I don't know why I did that. But the discussion in that class was always so much what was allowed to be portrayed of Black history on film rather than just Black history on film, right? And so when people are trying to discern the truth, what are some of those risks and assumptions that people make, especially for people who are well-known, like MLK, like Coretta, like Bayard?
I think first, as a historian, I push back against the idea of the truth, because I think people bring their different truths. I think there are sets of facts we have and evidence and things that happen. And one of my favorite theorists about history, Michel Roth-Triot, always talks about the materiality of history. Like there are residues that we can't walk away from, in fact. But I think we all bring a different, even if you do oral history or something, you talk to people, they all, and about one same event, they all have a different sense of what that truth or experience was. And it's not as if they are misremembering it, but they all are watching from a different perspective. And I think
even within a family.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And I think that's sort of, to me, the joy and interesting things about history, other than the fact that you get to read people's letters and not be called a gossip. I'm not a snoop. I'm studying.
I'm just studying. Like, oh, I love history.
But
It does get juicy.
It does.
yeah, it really, really does. I like the archives. But I think in my class, the students really raise this question, and it changes over time. So we watch early films and films that are made more recently, and we had an interesting discussion about who shapes the perspective. And I often am like, can you tell who's written the piece by what the piece, how the film takes shape? And one of the things they note, like some of the limitations on the films we see, like what does it mean to have a film where there are more Black characters than white characters, right? And you can watch the history of the development of around, say, the history of slavery or something through film, and you can see that shifting over time, where there always has to be certain white characters that save the film, take Amistad or something like that. And I think I had thought about it, but then my students immediately, because they were really on the ball, just pointed it out. Why is this the case? And then we watch this other film, and that's not what's central to it. And so I do think there's some of that understanding that students today are really savvy viewers and sort of critical sort of readers of film and media, that they are aware of. And it does, I think, raise this question not only about how the story gets told, but who tells the story, what perspective they bring to the story. And I think that's rarely talked about, that in part, it matters the perspective someone brings as they're gathering the facts, right?
Yeah.
That what I see as important might not, we all go to the archive, and what I think are crucial points in the archive are crucial evidence from historical books we read. Other people might not. Oh, that's a secondary story. The real story is Kennedy, right? But someone else might read and say the real story is Coretta Scott King, or the real story is Rustin, right? And so I think in part, it's a multitude of things that go into shaping sort of Black film and how people think about history in that context. And I think both in film and history, we can see the shifts over time as more Black scholars, more Black filmmakers, more Black actors, people doing sort of cultural, even fiction, right? Some of the ways in which we can tell these stories that not only are true to the history or the facts on the ground, but also try to, I think, more importantly, why I love thinking about history alongside creative works, is that it's how do you convey the interiority, the feeling, the emotion, the passion, the struggles of it, that the humanness of history, I think. And as a historian, I try to do that in the page, but you know, that's 300 pages later.
Right.
And I often find giving someone fiction or a creative work will lead them back to history, because then they want to know.
They want to know.
Yeah, like, was that real? Did that really happen?
Yeah.
You know, and we just recently watched Harriet, the film Harriet, and then the students were, did she really do that? That seems impossible. I was like, well, they're a great biography. Let's go through it. You know, we talk about the historical moments. How might you understand what she sees as sort of her speaking with God, as sort of her intuition or other things? How might different people interpret that? And so it's really, I think, an interesting moment, interesting sort of combination pairing that I find very powerful. And that's why I teach the class, to have folks sort of be able to bring those two things together and get people excited into reading history. And also to have them think about what really moves me as a historian is not necessarily the facts, but it's trying to think about how people negotiate these really complex, powerful moments, and that we think of them as extraordinary people. But when you get close enough to it, you can see that they have many of the foibles or limitations or struggles that we all have. And I think particularly for things like civil rights movement, or I'm a scholar of the social movement, so trying to get people to think about how you make change, that's so important, so that they have a sense that these people aren't extraordinary or extraordinary, maybe the moment is, but they bring a passion and a commitment to it, and being able to have an understanding of that, I think, is really powerful.
One of my favorite things, too, is that when you're talking about the interiority and the sort of personality of the people, is that there's something about, you study history and you go, well, of course, this is the way it had to go, right? This is history. This is what happened. It had to happen that way. But when you have the access to the human beings, if you get more of the experience, like, oh, it didn't have to work out. They didn't have to say yes to the march. They didn't have to decide to do this. It's not a foregone conclusion. It's just the way things actually, it is what happened, but only because of these very particular human beings at this particular moment. So I feel like that's part of what this play gets at.
Well, I'm also just like smiling super wide, because I feel like as big of a nerd as I am, Aaron kept pushing me almost like relentlessly throughout the development process. Is like, focus on the human, focus on the interiority, focus on this. And like, that's why I really describe this show as like me building it as like a coloring book, because I would use the history to kind of like set up the scenario or set up the dynamic or understand what's specifically happening at the time. And then interiorly in all the scenes, we're focusing how that is informing their behavior, or how their perspective, how they're negotiating with each other, how they're trying to work through those dynamics. And it's like some of those things that you don't always get to see in the academic text. So playing in that play field has been great.
Yeah. You guys are answering all my questions before I'm able to even ask them. But I'm going to ask this one anyway, just so we can get just like the clear line from the artistic perspective. You know, when we do research to find a new feature or something new about someone we already know, or when we write new plays about people who exist, there may be a canon full of MLK plays. There is a canon of MLK plays. what is the responsibility that you all have as the artistic side of this to create something that is tangible that then lives on forever as a part of this person's history? You know, it becomes part of the canon. It becomes the did that really happen moment for another generation. So what is that responsibility to keeping them still whole and human?
Well, I think, like, for me in drafting this play, you know, it's important that this play is done now, but I wasn't even thinking about right now. I'm thinking about, you know, when I'm dead and gone, 70, 80 years from now, and there are kids somewhere, hopefully, with access to, you know, plays like this with these books, and they are trying to figure out what happened before they got here, because somebody did that for me. And they probably didn't even know that that was what it was going to be, right? And so for me, it's like, what is the actual highlight or specific thing that we need to know about this person? And how were they able to keep pressing on and keep continuing to fight for civil rights with all of the things that were happening to them around them? I feel like so many times we can often feel like we don't have the wherewithal or the well of compassion, as I refer it to fight for our rights or to fight for our neighbors' rights, right? And so I kind of wanted to show this picture and this dynamic of these people who were able to have the pressure of the world on top of them and still being able to carry on. And if they were able to, then maybe I can too, right? So that's really what I was after. And I think with Dr. King, he is growing up in Atlanta, you know, he was somebody we learned about all of the time. You know, I even met Coretta Scott King when I was very young, and she was still alive when she was running the King Center. And so for me, you know, I had been in proximity to this history for a while, but really wanted to show a human side of all of these people because the giants and the people we respect are human at the end of the day.
You want to add, Aaron?
You don't no.
Say you don't have to.
Yeah, no.
That's beautiful. I love that. Legacy. So I want to talk a little bit about the second part that we were thinking, collaboration and democracy. The American Five explores how the influence of different opinions and viewpoints was not always received with open arms and open hearts. You know, these were real humans. They had their own ideas of the stance. There were bumps and bruises along the way. They may have said things that hurt each other, but they still got to that end goal. That, in a lot of ways, is a lot like Lincoln. He built a cabinet of his team of rivals because he understood at that moment in time there was no way that he could lead out of this time period that we were living through without the ideas and opinions of people that opposed him. He understood that made him a more whole, gave him a more whole photo, a more whole picture. So, Chess and Aaron, can you guys share a little bit about your process and how the two of you who come from very different worlds were able to come together and collaborate to get us to what we see in 3D today?
I want you to go first. I don't know. What do you want me to say? I mean, I trusted you from the start. I guess I could kind of say maybe, or like
Kind of.
yeah. I'm thinking about like because that's genuinely how I feel. You know, we came into this process. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm, you know, the real story.
Yeah,
right?
that's what
the real story is like when we first met, and I read this 3-act play that I thought was super interesting and super problematic, and said, "Do you want?" Like there was so much good in it, and I was like, and I've been doing this. I mean, I've written 20 plays, and I've been doing this for 35 years, and so I said to Chess, "Do you want all my thoughts? And you don't have to have any of my thoughts. I'm going to direct whatever you give me. I've been asked by Fords to do this." And Chess said, "Give me every thought you got." And I was like, "Really?" And
Yes.
And I said, "Yeah." And then we started, and from the first conversation, we started an honest conversation about what was there, what would be most valuable, what would help, what was taking us in the right. So it just became an open conversation in which I felt as I think we both felt,
Yeah.
I will say both of us, that we had exactly what you want in a collaboration, which is a lot of transparency, a lot of honesty, a lot of disagreement,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
a lot of agreement. But you know, it was the understanding from the word go is this is Chess's play, Chess's vision, Chess's ideas.
Yeah.
I'm there to push, prod,
Yeah.
pull,
Yeah.
ask hard questions, make strong suggestions, to which the final outcome was always whatever he thought was going to be the final thing. But I
Yeah.
was going to, for the first part of the
Right.
collaboration,
Right.
and then we shifted once we went into rehearsal,
Right.
where
Right.
it went like, oh, now I care deeply about what you think, but now I'm directing the play. And the collaboration shifts, and and all the steps along the way. It included Jose from Ford's, and it
Yeah.
included you, and it included
Yeah.
the casting process, which was a kind of collaboration, and the design process, and then once you have the actors in the room, you're setting up new strands and new balances all the time, and you're trying to do everything within your as academics, right? Trying to do everything to prevent the group from becoming a committee and
Right.
staying a collaborative process, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the committee will take things down to the lowest common denominator too often, not always, but often.
Yeah.
But a collaboration will take things to the highest denominator or the highest common ground. And so we all pushed each other, and we agreed and we
Yeah.
disagreed, and we found ways of refining the story to be what has more complexity, more drama,
Yes.
right? Because
Yes.
it's like
We're doing a play.
the scenes in which everyone's like, oh, I think you're super smart. Oh, I think you're great. Like, those are not interesting scenes.
Yes.
So you want to see where people are disagreeing and where their
Yeah.
different perspectives are coming from. So
Yeah.
I feel like that's more or less what we did.
That is it.
And it was
We're like
super
the physical embodiment of
Clarence and
Stanley
Stanley.
Stanley
Yeah.
and Clarence, Stanley and Martin.
Yeah,
like, depending
yeah.
on what
the conversation
lane,
is. Yeah.
You guys were the physical embodiment. I said we had a internal staff meet up with Chess, and I said to them, I was like, this is one of those like unique shows where the process that you see happening on stage is exactly the process
Happening behind
that
the
is happening
scenes.
to get
Yeah.
these actors to
Yeah.
the stage. There was so much echoed in teamwork that is representative on that stage that happens in our room whenever we're putting up a show. And so it's such a unique space
It reached we started from very different places. We were learning from each other. We
Yeah.
were learning each other's sensibilities. We had this moment about maybe
was
2
in
weeks
March.
ago.
Oh,
Yes,
oh.
No, about 2 weeks ago at a rehearsal.
Oh,
we were
yeah.
watching like the final drafts of scenes before we're sort of locking the script. And Chess and I are both taking notes on cuts for the scene.
Oh, yes.
And I don't know that I'd ever had this. It was truly hilarious. Where we're both listening to the scene, we're both marking our scripts, and then we go to compare them, and I go, yeah, I don't know that, and he's circled the exact same thing. And
Same
then I've
to the word.
gone to this line and going like, this needs to be. He's like, yeah, I know, sharp. And like, so by the end, we were basically thinking the
Yeah.
same thoughts,
That's really
which was
great.
super fun too.
Yeah.
I love that.
I think on like the bringing us to today and like why that kind of collaboration is so important. I often like with my few mentees that I have that are in college now, I tell them to have the confidence to be right, but the willingness to be wrong. And I think that's something that like a lot of people just like generally are missing.
Especially in the arts.
Oh, what in the arts? Yeah, I mean,
My work? What?
Well, because artistic expression is so personal and it's so wrapped up in it. But I often like to approach just like life in general. Like if somebody tells me I've done something wrong, I assume they're right. And not because I actually want them to be right, but mostly because I'm trying to figure out what the scenario is that led them to their system of thinking, right? So it's like, I'm just trying to understand from their perspective, like how they got there. And maybe in that journey of understanding, there is some fault that I had or something that I did or what the dynamic is, and maybe I'm understanding their perspective, things that they brought to the conversation I wasn't aware of, X, Y, and Z. But I think that's something to consider because I grew up in a Black Jewish household. And then moved to Atlanta for like the latter half of my childhood. And then I went to University of Michigan where you had students from all 50 states, 140 countries. Just meeting a lot of people from all over the place and all over the world. And I think the one thing that academia does teach you is that you do not and cannot ever know everything, right? And I think,
Yes, y'all can
yes. And I think that's why education is so important. You know, one of the big conversations that I'm hearing is like about whether or not college is worth it. And for me, I distill it down to that. It's because like that experience of going to a place where you're meeting people globally or even just from all over your state, and being exposed to the reality that you do not and will not know everything. There's too much knowledge and too many people in this world is very critical. So I think people have to readjust their posture that they're bringing to collaboration, because there is no society without people being in community. It does not exist. So.
I have a good question that kind of leans into what we're talking about right now from the audience, that says there's so much pressure on the arts today to carry the concerns of the voices of society. So how do you find the motivation, and like what words of wisdom do you have like to keep moving forward? And I think we can open this up into just the arts and humanities. So it could be a question for all three of you.
You know, what I've appreciated in this process and what I try and do in my own work, whether as a playwright or as a director, and it sounds like the word truth has come up several times in terms of, you know, you hopefully people were wise enough to know that our truth isn't the truth, but it is a truth, and that if you're willing to share your truth, that's where you have the capacity to connect with other human beings in meaningful ways. And so this play works not because anyone could have done the research about the civil rights movement and gone like, oh, here's an interesting story. Like anyone can do the research, anyone can read the books, and the books are super interesting. But to be able to, as you were talking about, to see what Chess found in the books and said, you know, Stanley Levison, as a Jewish man who chose during the Montgomery bus boycott to go align himself with Dr. King in order to have an impact. You know, if you read the new, the Jonathan Ives' new great big 500, 600 page biography of King, Levison is mentioned in the book 50 times and explored 0 times. There's literally, he's there all the time at all the key things. He's mentioned as being there, and I don't literally think that there is a one sentence that says, well, why was this guy there, or what was going on, or how was it interesting? That has just been ignored. And Clarence Jones writes eloquently about in his own book going like, what the hell, why isn't anyone paying attention to Stanley? Stanley was transformative, was a huge part of this movement happening, and has been largely ignored by history because it didn't fit the narrative that people have had about the history they want to tell, which has also been very reasonable and probably right at certain times. But this is now you have Chess coming along as a black queer Jewish man going like, I want to acknowledge all of these identities and bring humanity and see the connection in all of these identities. So suddenly Stanley Levison has a voice at the artistic table. And so, but you know, if you're willing to bring your own truth, and I think this is true as a playwright, this is true as an actor, as a director, as a designer, whatever it is you're doing, if you're willing to bring your own truth and share your vulnerabilities and share your flaws and listen up, like then you have the capacity to connect to people strongly and meaningfully. So that's what sits at the center of it for me.
Dayo, do you want to talk a little bit about the women and some of because there is a gaping hole still about their role and what they were doing essentially for this process?
I mean, I think the point you make is really important, and I was thinking this about the work, including Levison not only adds a voice, it's not only about adding Rustin or Coretta King or Levison, but it makes us think differently about the moment. So we begin to see the movement not just as a Southern movement, but then the North comes in. So I think about Jean Theo Harris's King of the North that talks about Martin Luther King in the North and how that so much, he goes to school there, how much that influences his life. But we begin to see the movement is not just something happening over there, but a national sort of influence that bring people who have been organizing in all these ways in different places. And it makes us think differently about it. I think the less seen figures, the different perspectives are not just about making a bigger tent and everyone gets a moment to say something, but it's about also challenging how we understand it, right? And how we understand this moment and how we understand movements building, the power of it. And so in part, you get to understand that King's power is not just his oratory, right? But it's also who he surrounds himself with, that he picks sort of folks who bring a plethora of experience, but it's also that he has support financially, which we rarely talk about in the movement, how central that was to the movement to have that support, and how it's a movement that maybe gets centered in the South, but has a national and global reach. And I think those things often get erased from the story, but more and more, I think historians are trying to talk about it. And I think the same is true with women, because when we see, I think, even though King dominates the story now, I think you can't tell a story about the civil rights movement without including the amazing work that organizers and women do. And figures like Coretta Scott King, Ella Baker, who's so central to sort of keeping the Southern Christian Leadership Council afloat. You think about all the Fannie Lou Hamer, all the women who are organizing in the South, doing the daily work. Diane Nash, who's a student organizer, who's so central to it.
She founded SNCC, right?
She was one of the key, Ella Baker was a key figure in bringing the students together under Martin Luther King's organization and saying, we need to give students a voice. They're trying to tell us a new way of thinking about things. And Diane Nash, who's been active in Nashville organizing, becomes one of the key leadership of that. So it becomes a sort of a central way. And without those figures, we don't sort of see how this movement happens, how the march comes to be in some ways. And even the figures, you know, we can talk about who gets to speak at the podium, because then you do get to see some of the limitations.
Yes,
of the movement, right? So that people talk about Josephine Baker speaks right before Martin Luther King's speech, and she's a pretty famous Black dancer who has lived in France for a long time, comes back, is super financially supports the movements for a while, and then gives a very brief speech. We think about Daisy Bates, who gets to speak just briefly in this honor roll of women, which, as if the women can't speak for themselves, which is troubling. But it speaks to, I think, making that visible, makes visible some of the real tensions in the movement, right? That we will see come out, right? Become women's roles and women's voices become a big part of sort of some of the tensions as the movement develops past 63 into 64 and 65. And I think in part, having this big five, right, centers these figures, but it opens up space to think about the others. Who else don't we see in there, right? You don't actually have to include them to raise the question, right? So I think that's a powerful thing. How else, and to begin to ask, why don't we know these people? Because I think that's the other important question. Why don't we understand them as central figures? And I think part of that speaks to how I think we have been taught to think about the movement in very constrained ways, like it's one powerful leader and that's it. And that limits the power of people to make that possible, right? And that it was only about this issue located here as opposed to an issue that was happening all over the country, that people were sort of mobilized for, even if they weren't fighting the exact same laws. They were feeling sort of resonance with the struggles against white supremacy that were happening in the South, with the violence, with the brutality of the police. And so I do think there's a way in which it might be the five, but it opens the door, right, to be able to think about other people that we might be missing. So I often love teaching that, because I teach Rosa Parks, and my students are like, if Rosa Parks had been an activist and she wasn't just tired, then what does that mean about other people? Let me go investigate. And I think hopefully this work makes us think differently about you know, this moment.
Yeah. I'd say for me, like, going back to, like, you know, the pressure to, like, be a voice of the time and X, Y, and Z and why that's important. I think it's important because I don't want the future to have to do what we're doing right now, right? Is to going back and say, like, okay, what part of this history is missing? Why don't we know this? Why was this left out? Why is X, Y, and Z, right? So it's very important for us to tell our stories now and use storytelling as a way to preserve history and keep it alive for the next generation, because there is so much hidden history that we don't know about. And there's several things in the show. There's several dynamics in the show that I think are just, like, so fascinating. One that I think is super fascinating is the relationship between Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King Jr., right? And I think it's very important for us to stop painting this narrative that religious leaders and church leaders have always been vehemently homosexual, right? Like, that is not the case. There are preachers who have loved on their LGBTQ brothers and sisters, Black preachers specifically, right? We need to stop painting this idea that women are less educated, because that is not true. They have been the muscle and the backbones of this movement and of society for generations, right? This idea that white folks or Jewish folks cannot show up and fight for social justice. People have been, and they continue to. So just because you think somebody hasn't done it is not a reason for you to rest on your laurels, right? And there's exactly, right? And so I think we need to keep these stories alive and to start to tell our own and the ways in which we work together and the ways in which we coalition build and collaborate, because it is critical to our future and it is critical to sustaining life on this earth.
Look at how you just...
I love everything you said, except I think it's just so interesting that you think like, oh, because you're going to do it now, that future generations won't have to.
Yeah.
No, but Coretta Scott King said that.
Yeah,
she said that this fight has to be won with every generation.
Right.
My point is like, we have to continue to do this work so that it is accessible and available, and they don't have to go as deep as I have had to. Or
except they will, because they're going to see things that you're not seeing.
Yeah.
That's what I love
Yeah.
is that it will have to keep happening.
Yeah.
Because I love the fact, like it's all the blinders I've had on in my life where I'm like, oh, my blinders are finally off. Oh, no, more blinders. Oh, there was more blinders. I didn't know there were more blinders. You know what I mean? That this gets to be a dynamic process that just gets to keep happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, but I think it's so important to what you're saying that you have to be able to take in people's feedback, because to imagine we could know everything, but also to imagine we could live in a world without blinders. Like we don't, our necks don't go around far enough. Like we're not going to be able to see it all. And it's how do you take in that lack of vision you might have about certain things without taking offense? And I think that's true of the arts. I think that's true of history. That I want people to write books that point out some of the limitations of my writing, because I know they're there. And I want people to engage my work in a real enough way to say, I value it enough to both say, yay, I love it, but also to say, hey, you could do all these other things are absent. And so I think that's a really important sort of moment of engagement. And we will, hopefully there will be many more books, many books on these people as there are on Lincoln and King, and many plays as they are on these figures. So I hope the future generations look back at your work and, find ways to expand on it or think differently about it. Great.
Well, y'all just answered all of the questions in my third section that's about legacy for today and beyond. It's basically that movement forward. How do we move forward? What are the accountability? What accountabilities do we have to the next generation?
Yeah.
What things do we need to put in place? I do want to share, our friend Ben is in the back, and he has been tweeting us in the Q&A, and I just want to read what he has shared with us, because I think what we were talking about in terms of who's missing, asking the questions, Ben was hitting on it as we were talking about it. And so I just want to share. It says, hello, my name is Ben, and I'm a 25-year-old non-speaking autistic epileptic who uses a letterboard for typing to communicate. I am so proud to be a donor of Ford's Theater, as they have always been so inclusivity-oriented and supportive of me and my peers and inclusivity. I wanted to say that what you were saying about having the stories from the direct perspectives of the characters via research is so impactful and so resonates for me, as I often see portrayals of people with disabilities without their actual input and sentiments, which is crucial to the true history depiction. So thank you for what you have done.
Thank you, Ben.
And I just wanted to share that, because I think that's the meat of what we do. That's the meat of this play. That's the meat of the work that you do, Dayo, is to show what is real for us, show what could be another perspective, just to keep the story going, because these people are here. We are here.
Yeah.
Your existence is important, and it is represented now on that stage. And that's so impactful. I'm going to just go ahead and ask the question. So when we talk about what's next, because this work that Lincoln put into play in 1865, this work that Martin put into play in 1963, the work that you all have now put on the stage in 2025 is just continuing the same conversation. So what do you all view as the next steps for activism from this point on? Like how do we continue to fight for the things that we are seeing are lacking in the 2025 era? How do we keep the message going until we get to the big, beautiful world? and take your moment. You had it was loaded.
I mean, I'll just say this. This is often what I think about and talk about with my students. And I think the play is a good place to start with this because figures like Levinson, Rustin, Ella Baker are around much earlier than the 60s. And they are committed to organizing and mobilizing in ways and then continue to sustain after. And they go in different directions. But I think that sense of the struggle as ongoing is important. Like it's a sustained thing, and it's about a commitment to change that is probably a lifetime's work or longer, right? And I think all of those figures had that commitment to it for their life, and I think that is, in part, to me, what I often talk to students about, right? Not every generation will have this transformative victory, and I sort of came of age in the sort of shadow of the civil rights movement, and all my teachers were active in the 60s and 70s, and they would talk about it, and I was like, is that what a movement, and as a child of the 80s, I mean, everyone's like, the 80s, not a lot happened, but I think, you don't have that
boring decade.
It actually isn't, but you don't have that same sense of like, when you're thinking about, the protests at the mall, I mean, think about the bigger protests at the mall. You're just like, and it's a surprise. I wrote about the 50s. That's the period I write about because I was looking for moments that didn't have this same 40s and 50s sort of exuberance. But I think so much of what happened in the 40s and 50s made the 60s happen. Possible. And I tell students that you might not see the sort of fruits of your labor right in this moment, but that sense of sustained commitment to justice, to equality, to including those marginalized voices is what matters. You have to find, in the collective work of it, right? Being committed to being with other people in this project, not just trying to do it yourself, is so important. And that builds something that is, I think, a fabric for our lives, but also for the movement that sustains. And you don't know who's watching when you're doing that work, I don't think people are always aware that they're having an impact on other people until you get to look back and someone writes a story about it for you, right? So I think that I partly think about this future generation. Part of that work needs to continue, even if it feels dire, even if it feels not possible. In part, some of the most powerful sort of activists that influenced the 60s were doing it in the midst of the 50s, where they felt, they had very little support. They weren't making an impact. And then, lo and behold, you ask some of these students in the 60s who really influenced you, and they talk about, think about Rustin, or they talk about Ella Baker, or they talk about Claudia Jones, or they talk about activists who are doing this work, Paul Robeson,
Randolph,
as figures,
Randolph,
who had been active for a long time. So I think that's partly what I think about in these moments, but we have to pass on the ability to sustain engagement and sustain a sort of investment in other people in doing this work.
What I think is next for activism is a return to the analog, right? Like, I think our movement as a society towards the hyper-digital actually has just created so much distance between us and the realities that we live in, that oftentimes the cog in the machine is that we don't have the opportunity to have analog activism, which is like in-person, felt, realized dialogue. I mean, even this dialogue is different than something that might just, be live streamed, right? And the thing I'm thinking about is like the impact of the Montgomery bus boycotts, right? And it's like, I did a lot of student activism when I was in undergrad. And one of the things I kind of make fun of now is like these, we're going to do like a social media blackout for a day. And I'm like, the Montgomery bus boycott was 13 months. And they walked 5 miles to and from work. We're getting...
But they changed their picture on their Facebook page. That's a lot of...
But do you
you
see specifically like my point, right?
Yeah, it makes it more real.
Yeah, I think so. There's not like, I always say like the first step to being an activist is to be active. The first step to be an advocate is to actually advocate for somebody or something, right? And so I think there will come a time when people realize that we have to get off of our computers and off of our phones and back into the analog. And the analog is where so much work and organizing happens and happened. And that is where it is sustained. It is in the real life. It is in the systems. It is in the ways we operate, the ways we engage, the way we shop, the way we vote, the way we study, the way we commune. All of those things matter, and all of those things influence the way our society operates. So that's my hope, is a return to the analog.
Very true.
Yeah.
Aaron?
Well, things are getting really complex.
Yeah.
And so complexity will lead to movement, I think. And so I think, so, you know, like when people are responding to this play and responding to what's happening in the world, that's going to lead in whatever direction or whatever ways it's going to be leading, you know, but it's going to be leading towards action, because action is going to feel required from whatever perspective you come at it. So
Yeah. Well, thank you, thank you, thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you. You all are amazing. We do hope that you enjoyed our conversation today. Today's Cabinet Conversation was live streamed and can be found on the Ford's Theater YouTube channel. If you have not purchased your tickets, you should have a little QR code to scan today if you're in the house. But please go get your tickets to see The American Five, now on stage at Ford's Theater through October 12th at www.fords.org. We really, truly hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. Now you go off to